All right, today we're diving into a story that honestly feels more like a legend than history, the life of Joan of Arc. And we're going to look at it through a really interesting lens, the eyes of Mark Twain. Yeah, that Mark Twain. He actually spent more than 10 years of his life completely obsessed with her story, researching and writing about this young woman he thought was one of the most incredible people to ever live.
I mean, just look at that quote, Mark Twain. This is a guy known for being a cynic, a satirist, right? He was totally captivated by her, calling her life flawless and ideally perfect. So you have to ask, what could possibly make a man like Twain say something like that? To get it, to really understand, we have to go back in time and see the world she was born into. A world that was so completely and utterly broken, it was practically screaming for a miracle.
So let's paint a picture here, and you can forget all the romantic ideas you have about knights in shining armor. The France of the early 1400s was an absolute nightmare. It was basically a failed state, a kingdom on its deathbed, just bled dry by nearly a century of war and total chaos. This right here gives you a taste of the pure anarchy. This wasn't some organized war between two countries. No, this was a messy, brutal civil war, with different French factions tearing each other apart, and the English just swooping in to take advantage of the chaos. For a regular person, life was terrifying. There was no safe place. Gangs of soldiers would just roam the countryside, looting and burning everything in their path.
Just let that phrase sink in for a second. Slaughter was a daily pastime. It's hard to even imagine. In the capital, Paris, rival groups would literally unleash mobs on each other. There was no law, no order, no justice to speak of. It was a society that had completely fallen apart at the seams.
The cities were just gruesome. Bodies were left in the streets, spreading disease. And while all this is happening, what's the leadership doing? Well, the guy who was supposed to be leading the charge, the heir to the throne, the Dauphin Charles, he was completely paralyzed with fear, basically packing his bags, ready to give up and flee the country. So, you've got a defeated army, a nobility at war with itself, and a king who's about to run away. France was literally on the verge of being erased from the map. So who on earth could possibly step into that mess and turn things around? The answer, incredibly, came from the last person anyone would have ever expected, a teenage peasant girl from a village nobody had ever heard of.
And this is where we meet Joan. Back in her little village of Dommery, she was known for two things, being incredibly devout and having this deep, powerful sense of empathy for everyone and everything. And that compassion was about to be tested in a way no one could have imagined. This story from when she was a kid, the one Twain tells, it tells you everything you need to know about her. The local priest gets up and condemns the fairies in the woods, basically calls them demons, and it's little Joan who stands up to him. Her argument, right here on the screen, it shows this incredible moral clarity. For her, it wasn't really about fairies. It was about her belief that everyone, even the outcasts, even the ones people called devils, deserves pity and compassion. That was the core of who she was. And then, when she was 13, her entire world shifted. She started having these experiences. She called them her voices. She was absolutely certain they weren't dreams, not her imagination. To her, they were real, direct messages from St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They were messages she believed from God himself.
And the mission these voices gave her, it was insane. She, an illiterate teenage girl from the countryside, was told that she had to lead the armies of France, that she had to smash the English invaders, and that she had to get the weak-willed Dauphin crowned as the rightful king. It sounds completely impossible, like something from a fantasy story. But for Joan, it was a holy command. She had no choice but to obey.
So at 17 years old, with literally nothing but this burning faith, Joan sets off on this impossible quest. Just try to picture it. This girl shows up at the doorstep of the defeated, cynical French court and says, "Hi, God sent me to save you all." You can just imagine the laughter, the ridicule, the suspicion she must have faced.
This timeline is just breathtaking. Look how fast this all happened. It took nearly 2 weeks just to get in the door. Then they grilled her for weeks on end, the top church scholars, trying to poke holes in her story, trying to find any hint of fraud or heresy. They found nothing. So finally, maybe out of sheer desperation, they gave her what she wanted, command of an army. Her first assignment, the city of Orleans, which had been trapped under a brutal English siege for months. Seasoned generals had failed. Joan shows up, and in 9 days, she shatters the siege. It was so unbelievable it felt like a miracle.
That victory at Orleans changed everything.
Overnight, she went from being this weird peasant girl with visions to the Maid of Orleans, the living symbol of God's favor. Her presence was like a lightning bolt to the French army. They went from being demoralized and defeated to believing they were invincible. She led them in one victory after another, clearing a path all the way to the city of Reims. And there, just as her voices had told her, the Dauphin was finally crowned King Charles VII. She had done it.
But it's right here, at the absolute highest point of her success, at the moment of her greatest triumph, that this incredible story takes a very, very dark turn.
Shortly after the coronation, Joan was captured in a minor battle by Burgundian soldiers, who were French but allied with the English. Now, normally, a war hero of her stature would have been ransomed immediately. But King Charles, the very man she put on that throne, he did absolutely nothing. He didn't lift a finger. He didn't offer a single coin. Why? We still don't know for sure. Was he jealous of her popularity? Afraid of her power? Whatever his reason, the result was the same. He completely abandoned the girl who had given him everything.
The English couldn't believe their luck. They went to the Burgundians and offered them 10,000 francs for her. And let's be crystal clear about this. That wasn't a ransom. That was a purchase price. They weren't buying a prisoner of war. They were buying a heretic. They wanted to put her on trial and prove that her victories were the work of the devil, and in doing so, destroy the legitimacy of the very king she had crowned. And so Joan's final battle began. But this one wasn't fought with swords and banners. It was fought with words and wits, in a rigged courtroom where her faith itself was on trial. The whole thing was a show, orchestrated by the English from start to finish, with a verdict that had been decided long before she ever set foot in the room.
I mean, just look at this setup. The mismatch is staggering. On one side, you have an army of 62 of the most educated, cunning, legal, and religious minds in Europe. And on the other, a 19-year-old girl who couldn't read or write, with no lawyer, no one to speak for. Their goal was simple: get her to confess to heresy, break her spirit, and then execute her.
During the long trial, they thought they had her. They laid what they believed was the perfect trap. They asked her this simple question: are you in a state of God's grace? See, it's a brilliant trap. If she says yes, she's a blasphemer, because church doctrine says no one can possibly know that for sure. But if she says no, she's admitting she's a sinner, which would mean her voices and her whole mission were a lie. There was no right answer. Checkmate.
And her answer is one of the most famous moments in legal history. It was so simple, so humble, and so brilliant that it completely sidestepped their trap. It left the entire court speechless. The official records say the judges were so stunned, they just ended the trial for the day right then and there. They came expecting to outsmart a simple peasant, and instead they found themselves facing a wisdom they couldn't possibly comprehend. But no matter how many times she outwitted them, no matter how many of these little victories she won in that courtroom, the final outcome of this sham trial was never, ever in doubt. After months of this relentless psychological torture, they finally wore her down. Threatened with being burned alive, she broke and signed a confession. But that wasn't good enough for them. A few days later, they went into her cell, took away her female clothes, and left her with only the male soldier's clothes she used to wear. When she put them on, because she had nothing else to wear, they had her. They declared she had relapsed into heresy, which carried an automatic, irreversible death sentence. It was a vicious, cynical trick to ensure she would burn. And so, on May 30th, 1431, in the town square of Rouen, Joan of Arc was tied to a stake and burned alive. She was only 19 years old. In her final moments, she asked a priest to hold a crucifix high so she could see it through the smoke and flames. Her last word was a shout of the name Jesus. It was a horrifying, tragic end to such a short life. But in that fire, her legend was forged into something immortal.
Her story is it's one of the most incredible rises and one of the most heartbreaking falls in all of history. In just 2 years, she literally changed the course of a war and became a legend. And our life really makes you think about a question that never gets old. What's better? A long, comfortable, forgotten life, or a short, brilliant one that burns so brightly it leaves a mark on the world that can never, ever be erased?